I am incredibly honored for this opportunity. I am again going to say that for those of you who were here earlier, I do not take it for granted that you are here on a Friday at 3:30 Eastern time because Fridays are hard. So if you are physically here on the Zoom, like physically here, physically, virtually, physically here, wow, thank you so much for making it. I'm very nosy. I mean, I'm a researcher, and as such, I'm curious about where you are right now. I know you're here in Zoom virtually, but if you can put in the chat where you are right now or where you're from, and wait, let's do a cascade. Let's wait. So just like type it in, and then when I say one, two, three. When I say three, hit the enter. Okay. So go ahead, just type it in the chat. Don't enter until I tell you to, please. Where are you listening or engaging us from? Ready? One, two, three. Hit enter. You're still typing. Oh, there it goes. I see it. Okay, I see it. I see it. Okay, wow. So we have a few people in town, State College. We have Dallas, Philly, Illinois, Wisconsin, Toronto. Hey, got someone in Brazil, North Philly. I'm loving this. Wow. Insisting insisting on blackness in so many places. I'm grateful for that. Okay, so I was just very curious. And you know, thank you, Kamaria is my colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Porter, for compliments on my feminist formation article. There, I'm assuming it's the first one. There's two of them. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but yes, I really don't take myself very seriously. I'm a jokester. Um, I'm very silly, and I'm the youngest in my family, and I get away with a lot. I have always gotten away with a lot being the youngest in terms of being silly, but at the same time, it's a somber time for me, and I'm gonna explain why. So this is a really interesting, um, emotionally, I'm in an interesting space. I have been working on this notion of mommy informed ontoepistemology for quite some time. I've been writing about it, and I'm going to share. And my intentions have been for quite a while to write a book about this. And I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Um, Maybe it'll say Wilson's talk on the top. It shouldn't say that anymore. It should say Black Studies. Okay. And thank you, Wilson, again for the invitation. I think this is it. Hmm. That the one that says stop hammer time. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and so this is the first time I give this talk in this way. I know it's going to be recorded and shared. So it's the first time I give this talk. I'm very privileged that a lot of people want to hear me speak, and so I tend to have different kind of slides already prepared. But this is the first time that I write this that I do this particular talk, even though I've been thinking about this for quite some time. Um, yes, the agenda is I'm going to give a positionality. I'm going to situate myself in this work, this notion of Black methodology. So fascinating. And I hope that that's the reason why a lot of you are here, were attracted to that notion. This is part of the series that I guess I'm the first speaker. Is that correct of the series? Nope, second one. Thankfully, I'm not the first one. Less pressure. I like that. I like that. All right. I missed the first one. I apologize, but I will check it out. Um, in the title, I talk about mommy informed ontoepistemology, and I'm going to break down what that means. What's mommy informed? Who is mommy? This woman, her name is Antelia Cambero, my mother. And I'm going to, just mention some examples of when I have drawn on her in the past, in my scholarship, and then I'm going to share with you how that sounds, hopefully I will do a really good reading of something that's not going to bore you. It's going to be exciting. It's when you turn something that's from the oral tradition into something written, things get, I don't know, lost. Things get morphed in translation, but I'll do the best to bring my oral tradition understandings into the reading of this execution of this mommy informed onto epistemology. And then we'll do Q&A, but before that, we're going to have our discussant speak, and then we'll have a conversation. Please feel free to write in the chat. It is awkward for me not to be in person. I prefer, it's my favorite way of engaging, to be in person, again, because I don't take myself seriously. I love making eye contact and side eyes and, reading the room and feeling the energy. And so the chats are a nice ways of kind of getting that dynamic. I already seen some engagement with the emojis. I love that. Thank you. Okay. My mother, I love her so much. Okay, so I love this picture of mommy. So my mother passed away on October 17th, 2023, which was not that long ago. And as I was saying earlier, I had intentions of writing a book about this this thing that I talk about in my scholarship, Mommy Informed, for a while. And one of the easiest things that Mommy Informed means is that I ask Mommy. I'm Mommy Informed because when I want to know something, I just asked her all my life. I told you earlier, I'm a nosy person. I'm a curious researcher. This is a good job for me. Um, I'm a what am I? I'm a researcher in the field of special education. Specifically, I study teacher education, the preparation of educators to work with students with disabilities. And I have an upcoming paper that asks the question, what is a Black feminist doing in a field like special education? Um, Insisting on Blackness in special education has been quite an adventure. My field is racist, y'all. I say it all the time. This is going to be recorded. I don't mind saying that they haven't admitted to it. Like the field of psychology, the field of psychology has actually made open statements about their role in contributing to systemic racism, epistemological racism. My field hasn't, but I am a proud um, special educator, proud, and also very um, much as I don't shy away from acknowledging that that is my research community, that is where I was forged professionally. I'm also unapologetic about naming my Blackness, insisting on Blackness, and calling out racism and special education's role in contributing to racism in in the United States and around the world, but especially here in the United States. So, situating myself towards this conversation about methodology, well, like I said, I'm a Black feminist. I've always been Black. And so that's it shouldn't be a controversial thing, but I guess it is. It's becoming more controversial for some people. Um, Mommy is a very common way of saying mom in Spanish. So I am from a Latin American context in many ways. Even though I was born in the United States, I grew up in Miami, Florida, and my first language was Spanish, and I did not speak English until I learned it in school. And I was Black then. When I was before I entered school, I was reminded all the time that I was Black in Miami, Florida. I was not confused about the fact that I was Black, even though I spoke Spanish. And it's interesting, and I have to say, even though I spoke Spanish, because the way language is racialized in this country is fascinating. How speaking Spanish has become a racialized group is complex, and it didn't happen here in the United States. Those of us from Latin America, we had racialized identities in Latin America, but it gets more convoluted when you come to the United States. And part of the immigrant experience for those of us who are Black people who are connected to, who have familial or transnational ties outside of these United States, part of the immigrant experience is to distance yourself from Blackness. And so yeah, I guess that's where the controversy lays or lies. I remember, I'm going to show a slide of myself on Telemundo. Okay, so Telemundo, they Telemundo, who watches Telemundo in this room? Anybody ever watch? The soap operas are very exciting and very like dramatic. Okay, I see a couple hands up. Okay, good. Telemundo. So, some interesting music. Sometimes you can hear some funny shows, you know. But growing up watching television before I entered school, before I learned English in the United States, that was Telemundo and Univision is what I watched. And a few years ago, I don't even remember, with the pandemic, everything's been a blur. And with my mom's, in 2022, when my mother got sick, everything became a blur there too. That was a paradigm shifting year for me, when she had a stroke in 2022. But anyways, sometime before she got sick, I was on Telemundo. I think there was three times, and one of my friends, Erica McCrae, she called the channel Tele Mildred, right? Because they kept inviting me, to speak to them, profesora, doctora, profesora, Mildred Boveda. And it's such a big deal for me to have this image up for you. Um, Not because I'm excited that I was on the news, although that's nice, but because growing up, I never saw Black women, not even like light-skinned Black women, not even what we call, some of us here, racially ambiguous, which is a joke. That's another conversation. That's another conversation, a little bit too deep for this talk. Like, you did not see Black women, a woman who looked like me, or lighter or darker, someone of Afro descendencia or someone of African descent. You barely saw us as experts or as main characters. And still today, to this day, it's not as often as it should be. It just, but growing up, I never saw it. Like, I never saw it. And I assumed everybody who was Black and spoke Spanish was Dominican too, because everybody that I knew who spoke Spanish in Miami was Dominican, and I would go back to the Dominican Republic. So it shouldn't be a big controversial thing to name the fact that I'm a Black woman, from Latin America, but I'm beginning to understand that that notion is a little bit difficult for some people to process, and I get it. I get it. And yet I don't, and I reject it at the same time. So I insist on Blackness, and I situate myself in this way. I put this image of me on Telemundo, not Telemildred, to show, just the dramatic difference between my childhood experience of never seeing images of Black women like my mother, or the other women in my family, represented in Spanish speaking media. But I did see it growing up quite a bit once I started going to school. When I started going to school, I remember Langston Hughes' poem. um what was it? Is it Mother to Son? Where Life for Me ain't been no crystal stairs. It was in English. And most of my school teachers in elementary school were African American women from the South. The students were Caribbean. Uh, Many of us were Caribbean. Many of us were from Latin America, mostly Black school. Most of our teachers were African American. We had two or three Bahamian teachers who had been in Miami for quite some time. And the I saw myself way more, believe it or not, in my schooling than I did in, let's say, Spanish media growing up. I did see myself, not see myself, but I did see Black people in Spanish media in sports and in music, right? Um, but that was incomplete. That was an incomplete image. So for me growing up, I was very fortunate, and I didn't realize until I became a teacher educator myself that most US students don't get the opportunities that I have Black women or Black people or people of color in the position as educators. So most of my teachers were in elementary school. My principal was a Black woman. Um, Most of my educators were looked like my family, right? Looked like my mother, my aunts, they sounded like them, even though they spoke English, right? We weren't speaking the same language, but they were familiar to me, and they introduced literature and poetry and curriculum that was very relevant to the Black experience, even though my Black experience started from a transnational, like Dominican, Miami context. So I saw Blackness as being transnational. I saw, even as a child, I understood it as such. And yes, I just wanted to show that picture of my mom. She's great. And that's me situating myself in this discourse. Special education, I was drawn to special education because of the reasons why a lot of people of color enter, specifically Black people, enter education as a field. When you look at surveys, most people enter special education when you do surveys of why you're in special education because they had a family member with a disability, or they themselves experienced disability, or they did some kind of after school activity in like Special Olympics. And then when you ask folks of color, they connect it to kind of some social justice reason. And it's important to understand, my mom was 44 years old when I was born, but not but and she was much older. And my mom always prepared me for her death. And the reason why she was always preparing me for her death, because she had me later on in life, was because her father died when he was 45 and she was 11. And her mom died 1974, which was 8 years before I was born. And I remember my mom mourning my grandmother until I was probably 7 or 8, and other people that she had lost. I remember her actively still mourning my grandmother, even though she had died years before I was born. And I don't know how long it's going to take for me to to get to the point. I remember the day my mom was like, enough, and she put away the pictures that she had up of people that she had lost, you know, and she put them, including my grandmother, and she put them in an album. She goes, it's time for me to put it in the album. And so, yeah, she gave me a lot of tools, and including how to grieve. It's a tool that my mom gave me. She was 44 years old when she had me. When I went to school, and I'm going to stop with this image so you can see my face. When I went to school, I was very fortunate to have a lot of teachers of color. But the first 2 or 3 years elementary school, I did have one Black woman who was a teacher, one white woman for one Black woman for second grade, a white woman for first grade, and a Latina, Cuban American, European descent woman um, for kindergarten. I remember that. And and school was hard. School was hard. It was very hard for me because my mom hadn't gone to school. So when my mom had me here, when she was 44, she had been here for 2 years in the United States. And she always told me stories about how she longed to have gone to school herself. She grew up in the 40s in Dominican Republic, where there wasn't compulsory education. And like I told you, her father died when she was 11 years old. So she actually started working at the age of 11. Um, it's something called criada. And so an older woman approached my widowed grandmother and asked her if she could have my mom work in her house. And this woman was of a higher socioeconomic status, of a nice class. Her name is Doña Clara. Doña, which is like mistress or Mrs., and then Clara, which means clear, or it could also mean light skin, light, Clara. And she asked to have my mom and my grandmother, who was widowed and had many children. She let my mom go over there because she promised her that she would pay for her education. That was the promise. And my mom worked for her from the time she was 11 to 18. She was not paid, but she was given lodging in the house. Um, and she didn't get the education that she was promised. My mom always told me this. This is always part of my childhood, like bedtime stories, right? Like it wasn't even bedtime. It was just like I always knew that mommy wished she went to school, that Doña Clara said she was going to take her to school, and that she never did. She never did. She never paid for her schooling. My mom would take care of another little girl who was also her age. She would walk her to school and come back and then clean the house, you know, get the house ready for this young girl and her little brother. And somehow there was always an excuse for why mommy wasn't able to go to school. So that really put in my mind like this incredible commitment to education and understanding that A, public education is not accessible to everyone. Being that I needed to take advantage of any opportunity my mom didn't have a chance to have. And I guess I can go on with C and D. I mean, it just shaped so much my relationship to my educational journey. It really did. And like I said, I remember Langston Hughes' poetry. I remember very class-based understandings of who I was. So I wasn't only aware that I was Black, and I was told all the time, que soy negra. Okay, I got it. We're Black. Got it. Okay, understood. But I also understood that we were coming from a certain socioeconomic and class background. And I'm not sure a lot of Americans, US-based people, have a strong class consciousness. I think other countries have a bit of a stronger class consciousness. And for example, there's times where students tell me that I'm upper middle class, right? And like, what's the difference between what is upper middle class, right? And you find out, listen, y'all, I thought I was middle class. I thought I was middle class. You couldn't tell me I was not middle class until I filled out my FAFSA. I thought I was middle class because I used to go to Dominican Republic where people had to use the bathroom. My first cousins had to use the bathroom outside, or like I would hear stories of my mother and how I would hear stories of my mother and how she didn't have shoes until she was 16, and I had many shoes by the time I was 16, right? So like I was clearly middle class, right? And when I filled out that FAFSA form and I found out, wait a minute. And by the way, I filled it out because I filled out all the forms for my family just because I spoke English. I was like, wait a minute, I'm not middle class at all, right? And I think a lot of us in the United States, we use these terms like upper middle class when we're talking about $200,000 and lower working class. And my parents' combined income, I could tell you what it was then. It was 20 something thousand dollars. My mom and my dad working together, and I really thought I was middle class too, right? So, it's but I, even though I had a misunderstanding of my class position in the United States when I was younger, I understood poverty and class, and I understood these types of things not from my instruction in school, but from these stories mommy would tell me, right? These stories that mommy would tell me, would share with me, were so critical in situating me in the world. And yes, I was fortunate enough to have um, teachers who were from similar or diverse backgrounds. Um, and they were not, just like what's typical in the United States, which is what, 90%, or in Pennsylvania, it's 91% white teachers. But in the United States, I think it's about 80% right now, 79, 80% white teachers. I didn't have that. I didn't have that, overwhelmingly white teaching. But nonetheless, I still we all get a standard curriculum in the United States. Not the same, but we still get like this, this notion of who counts and whose stories matters, and mine was always supplemented with my mother's stories. Okay. So I understood. Let me give you a simple example. My mom's birthday. Okay. I saw her tombstone recently, and it says May 20th, 1939. But I knew since I was a little girl, that's not her birthday. Her birthday is May 20th, 1938. I always knew it. My mom's 85, not 84 when she passed away the other day. What did that teach me as a little girl? That taught me a major thing. It taught me that what is formally on a piece of paper may not be what's actually happening. My mom never hid the fact that that was not her actual birthday. That she was like, that's my government birthday, right? That's my paper. That knowledge was a very important thing for me to get. And that's not what was explicitly taught to me through my public schooling, right? even with my very thoughtful teachers who were culturally responsive, that's a lesson that I learned from home, that just because it's on paper, on a document, or on a tomb, doesn't mean that that's the day the people were actually born. My relationship to what is real, my ontology, was very much shaped by these types of small things. But they weren't small things, they were major things that oriented to me into like what is truth and what is not. Let's go on to another slide. Um, okay. My mom, I'm just gonna show you a cute picture of her because she's so cute and I love her. Um, here we go again. Here's a picture of her. Let me see. Play from current slide. Here's a picture of her in 1940 on the left. 19, she was probably 39 or 40. I'm 41. She was probably around my age on the left. And then this is a picture of her in 2022 on the right, or maybe it was 2023. It was this year. It was after she had a stroke. My mom called herself a feminist and a revolutionary. She was a feminist and a revolutionary. She was a lot of things. She was very much a God fearing woman, too. Very much a Bible thumping Christian woman who knew her Bible in and out, who was a revolutionary and a feminist. And she was an anti imperialist. She was all these things. Now, these are terms that we throw around quite a bit in higher ed. I think it's really fascinating to me. Who and since higher ed is the center that's invited me to speak, let's talk about my relationship to higher ed, and it's my job, it's my day job. But my mother didn't access higher education, and I didn't learn about revolutionary thought or Marxism or feminism. I didn't learn that in school. I learned that through her. And so for me, it's so fascinating to sometimes see the policing that happens in the field of higher education, but not just in the field of higher education, in higher ed in general. The policing that happens in terms of languaging and identities, and are you really decolonial? And are you really feminist? And are you really, and all of this? And I'm just like, because guess what? Many people who are feminists, revolutionaries, decolonial, anti imperialists never even will access higher ed. And so to me, I just like sometimes I get caught up in it, and sometimes, I'm grounded in my introduction to this discourse is not higher education. My introduction, and that's a blessing to me. That is a blessing to me. Again, another mommy informed onto epistemic move, that I know that people who don't even read the books that we read or access the institutions that we access are theorizing about these things that we think we came up with, but actually it was their moves, and it was their revolutionary actions and their revolutionary or anti-imperialist longings that allowed theorists and people who had access to these institutions and who could write about these things to write about these things. I remember um, when I went to I went to Dartmouth College. Very interesting experience. My first time with white people, and it's in New Hampshire. It's an Ivy League school. And I was fortunate enough I was a chemistry major, and I did an abroad program. I went to Brazil and I learned Portuguese, and I went to Brazil, and it was Black. Portuguese was Black. I love Brazil. I was like, wow, this place is great. It reminds me of Dominican Republic. It was like a break from Dartmouth and the snow and New Hampshire, and that experience. It was really good. And I was introduced to Pablo Freire. Pablo Freire, I was introduced to him then, and I really appreciated Pablo Freire. But again, and this is the punchline for anybody who may have to leave early, I want to make it clear, and I loved Pablo Freire, still do, that I was attracted to Pablo Freire because of mommy's stories. And why do I say that? Because a lot of times we are encouraged as people of color, as people in the academy, to say I'm I'm a Freirean, right? Or I'm I don't know, in my field, special education, I'm a behaviorist. I draw from Skinner, which I would never personally say that, right? Or I say I'm a Black feminist. I know to say I'm a Black feminist is part of like my identities. But I wouldn't be attracted to Freire or Black feminism. And I'm very much aware, if it wasn't for my mom's orienting me towards certain things about education. So that's the punchline. Like that's the big giveaway that I'm of this talk, right? Um, I cite mommy. I mention her in so much of my work because I am very comfortable and unapologetic about the fact that she's the one who got me to think about the things that attract me to certain theorists who I'm also citing and I'm also in conversation with. But if it wasn't for her grounding, I probably wouldn't have responded, or maybe I would have been repelled by some of the other, or maybe that's why I am repelled or pushing back against certain things that don't align with how she helped me understand the world. Anyhow, I was going to say something else about Frady. Um, yeah, but I think people have said enough. So I think it's time to move forward. Definitely when I went to Brazil and I I read the works and I really appreciated the notion of pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think a lot of people forget the of the. As much as Frady has been cited, it's not pedagogy for, it's not pedagogy about, it's not pedagogy with, it's pedagogy of. See, he was clear, or at least I was able to recognize that he was clear, that all the fancy words that he was coming up with, and there was a lot of fancy words, were to name what he was truly learning from and of the oppressed. And I know that about myself. I'm very clear and I'm comfortable that my pedagogy, my methodology, my ethics are from the oppressed. And I'm okay with that. And I'm excited by that. And it's beautiful. And they're Black too. That's the series that we're in, right? They're Black. And they're not just the oppressed, right? So that's the issue. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was written what in 1960s and then translated in the 70s. Language has limitations. Um, Sometimes people who are such purists and they want to go to pre-colonial ways, and they talk about Spanish and they like romanticize Spanish. And I'm like, well, Spanish is a European language, but then also Spanish is a very Black language, at least the Spanish that I speak, right? Just like English is a European language, Portuguese, European languages, but then they've been mastered, and I use that term on purpose, by Black people. They've been dominated, they've been beautified, at least the English, Portuguese, and Spanish that I enjoy and I take pleasure in. And same thing with these methodologies that some of us use. This desire to be purist and to find this like pre-colonial, pre-Western way of doing things. I think that's extra work because we've been here this entire time, shaping, forming, being stolen from, being hijacked our ideas and appropriated as or reshaped for a Western audience. But there's things that all my life I've recognized. Oh, that's not a white person's idea, or that's not just coming from higher ed. That's something that people that I know that aren't even aware of these discourses live and breathe and understand and theorize and sense make all the time. So yeah, I hope that that was clear. I'm gonna take a minute to see all the things that are going on and that there's 39 messages. I see some woo, see some yes mama, see some quotes. Hey, Margaret. Okay, that was a little pause. I needed to catch my breath. We're doing okay? Okay, we're doing okay. All right, so I'm gonna continue on to the next. Oh, this is exciting, and I hope it doesn't bore you. Um, it's exciting to me. Hold on. Here we are. So I mentioned that I've been citing my mom for quite some time. Oops. Let's skip it. Okay. So I have 36 peer-reviewed journal articles at this point in my career. I'm an associate professor. Very fortunate that I have tenure and all that stuff. I'm an editor of a high impact journal, prestige, la la la. I'm at Penn State. How nice is that? And simultaneously, I was discouraged from doing this kind of writing. Like I said, my field, special education, And by the way, there's a difference between these like fields of studies, higher education, special education, right? The study of special education, and then what actually happens, right? It's not necessarily, it should be informed by one another, but they're not always the same. So when I'm talking about the field, I'm talking about my colleagues who are my peers and who peer review me, and who I peer review them as well. Anyways, I have 36 publications that are peer reviewed journal articles or peer reviewed chapters, and about 14 of them directly cite my mom. And that was before she passed away. So I'm not going to stop talking about her just because she's gone from this realm, right? I've been talking about her because, not because I was being clever or cute, or I don't know what possessed me to, actually I do know what, and it's interesting I use the term possessed, right? It's an interesting term. But anyways, although I was discouraged through my professionalization process, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what my professionalization process did. I knew simultaneously I needed a, as I was writing about inclusive education and educating students with disabilities in these institutions of higher education, I also needed to go beyond what I was being fed or told I needed to understand. And I needed to make sense of how much it was congruent with, or or how much it was not deviating, but it was crashing with what I knew. So the title of this talk is, it's, this is a Black feminist call to know what you know. I had to know what I knew because I was getting new information that was, I guess, the canon of my field. It was my professionalization process when I was special ed teacher, and then when I decided to enter academia. I was getting I was getting a certain set of theories and ideas and concepts and methods and ethical considerations that was standardized in my field. And I was like, but there's more to this than what my field is telling me. And so at first, like these first two examples, the first two are, and I'm fleshing out what I mean by mommy informed onto epistemology, especially now that she's not here anymore. It's not just I asked mommy. Moving forward, I'm still going to be informed by her, right? And it's not just I asked mommy anymore. I can't ask her. She's not physically here to answer me. But through her example, right? What she lived, how she moved, how she made sense. That's one way that my way of being, my ontology, and my way of knowing is informed by her way of being and her way of knowing. So just, and I remember in this one piece, I was just talking about how my family, um, even though they are typically framed in the literature, people who come from my community and my communities, whether it's the hood in Miami or Dominicans or immigrant or Black immigrants or Black people, like so many, I mean, so many intersections can go in who, how I saw myself being represented and my folks being represented in my formal, training. I went back to, wait a minute, but my people, they have habitus, right? They have social capitals. There was ways that people were navigating things, right? And how my research questions were shaped by, like, where did I get this um desire to constantly ask questions? Well, I had a mom who always answered them. And I know not all of us do, and not all of us did, but I was encouraged to be curious. And she was a storyteller, and her stories sustained me even when things got confusing in my formal education, right? Her relationship to formal ed, this one down here, this article here, The Mistress and the Master's House, Audre Lorde's statement of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? Or like that right there, that statement, it means it hits a little bit differently when you had a mother who had a master in some ways, right? She worked for free, which is what we call And people are still doing this today, by the way. There are children, there are young women, there are young men who are working just to eat food and have a place to lodge, and they're not getting paid well. So it's not just in the 30s and 40s, but what does it mean to have a doña or a don, right? And making connections between this very, very powerful Black feminist essay, the context which Audre Lorde initially made that statement, talking to her feminist peers, who, by the way, the context was they invited her for a conference. She was a Black woman for this feminist conference, and they invited her last minute, and she was like, "Y'all, like, you can't invite me last minute. These tools of the masters, they're not going to dismantle patriarchy, right?" And revisiting that, but also being okay with the fact, well, I know somebody who knows what that dynamic is, right? The dynamic of working in a home, and I this is not just metaphorical. I can draw beyond a little bit about how literally what that is. At least I did this in this particular piece when I was thinking about my relationship and my mom's relationship to formal education. Sort of what I was saying earlier about higher ed, thinking they got all the answers, and I'm just like, wait a minute, you guys are just you guys, it's interesting. We in this higher education space, we're just naming things that people are doing with or without a formal education. Mommy's genealogy. I have a very strong understanding of who my grandmother and my grandfather were, because she understood where her genealogy, just like I understand where my genealogy of thoughts are. And it's not just Foucault, right? Foucault's known for doing really great genealogies, and I love it. It's great. Or Nietzsche, right? It's not just them. We have genealogies too. Black people have genealogies, and they are aware and they honor in very different and interesting ways. Um, and just on and on and on and on. I can talk about how her, and I cited and I talked about how what she offered me drew me to this research question, or to this experience, or to this thought that I'm forming. Um, yes, so those are just examples. And I'm gonna again take a pause. We're doing okay in terms of time. Yes. Okay. So I don't know. I feel like I want to hear some voices. Anybody wants to chime in before I do a storytelling? Because those are just examples, right? Examples of what I mean. Listen, I'm writing a whole book about this. And like I said, this is my first time talking about me putting this book together. And um, and I told you what the punchline is. The punchline is, we don't learn how to think only in schools, right? Or we don't, or in higher ed, we don't learn. And I'm not the first to say it. And I'm definitely not going to be the last to say it. But yes, I'll pull up the last slide again. I'm not going to be the last person to say it either. But I am not just saying, okay, it's pedagogy of the oppressed, which is an important statement. But I'm going to say exactly, in my case, what my mom's experiences and navigations with oppressions, and also with joy and with brilliance and with opportunities and with ingenuity, what it offered me. And I'm encouraging my colleagues in many, many different ways, for, or not just my colleagues, but my students, to do the same.
Doc,
Thank you.
Dr. Boveda, you said you
Yes,
wanted a
yes,
voice.
yes.
I thought maybe I would interject a question and invite a narrative about this intersectional consciousness. I myself have been thinking about, let me turn off this heater because it's cold in here. I've myself been thinking about, in my own research on Black women's experiences of sexual assault and harassment on campus, that those moments of feeling classed, feeling raced, classed, and gendered, feeling intersectionality. So your experience of filling out that FAFSA, like, oh wait, I'm not what I thought I was. And when I compare myself, I just have to reorder these categories, which in that reordering further oppresses me, right? Um, I also I also wanted to talk about, as a Black feminist scholar, we are pushing against the traditional narratives of whether it's higher education, the field, or special education, uh, that when our experiences are flattened and erased, and in your feminist formations article, the particularly I think it's the 2016 one, you talk about a classmate who writes about your story and kind of flattens you into the narrative of Afro Latina women don't succeed in highly competitive Ivy League institutions, and bundles you into a convenient narrative for her own purposes, but also for the purposes of white supremacy, to say, like, why have access when this is what's going to be the outcome. So I'm wondering if you could talk about, just your reflection on bringing that into your article, but also the Black feminist project of, rejecting that flattening and erasing.
I really thank you. And that's going to be, I'm going to share a slide. I'm going to answer that question because it's a great question. Then I'm going to story tell because, you know, mommy stories are better than my own. I'm trying to do the best, y'all. But okay, so the flattening. I'm going to share this image of that I often use. And I often share it because it just shows how sophisticated my mom was. And I'm listen, y'all, like I'm not just saying because she was my mom. This woman, hopefully when I write this book, you'll get it because it really isn't just because she's my mom and we love our moms, but she's
The
just
slideshow.
yes. Here we
Great.
go. So in the middle of this picture, I tell this story and it goes to this flattening question. So in this piece that I wrote, the Kamaria is talking about in 2016, a Chicana woman encouraged another Dominican girl, not a young woman, she was 20, to talk about me leaving Dartmouth College. And I alluded to me being at Dartmouth College and how white it was. Yeah, when I left Dartmouth College, I was on the dean's list. When I left Dartmouth College, I left this Dominican girl. It was another Dominican girl who wrote the story. And it was a Chicana woman who encouraged her to write the story about how, like, she's from the hood and she's so poor and she's so whack. And how three of us came into Dartmouth and only she was the one. She was the one Dominican, the one Afro Latina, the exceptional one, the special Dominican, right? The special Black Latina girl to get a Dartmouth degree. And she described me when I chose to leave, and it was very agentic. Again, I was on the dean's list. I had not to be competitive, but I didn't leave that school because I couldn't handle the curriculum. I left that school because it was overwhelmingly, ridiculously white and privileged, and I did not see myself flourishing there the way I wanted it to. Anyways, I ended up going to another Ivy League school. I still did the whole Ivy League thing. But what shocked me was at an ARA, I bumped into this Chicana professor and I didn't know. I had no idea that she had written or that my friend had written because it was under her auspices. She asked all these Latino students to write about their experiences and they put it in a book. And when I left Dartmouth College, they had no idea I would end up being a professor. And they had no idea that I would find out about this book. And this young woman who was another Dominican girl, she anonymized her name, but she kept my name and made me ultra marginalized in this book. And this Chicana professor who I adored, I thought so highly of, encouraged her to do this. I was not gone. See, like right now, moving forward, the ethical considerations I need to make sense of as I continue to cite my mom is okay, how do I do this dutifully now that she's not physically in this room anymore? My mom has passed away. I was not passed away. I just left Dartmouth. They could have called me Y'all, they wrote this thing. It was ridiculous. Like it was such a trope. And it was two Latina women who were doing this like super white gaze performance of only one of us can handle Ivy League schools. And when they found out that I read that thing, the backtracking, the fear, the shock, and also the sense of betrayal. And I am from a place where we don't tattletale, we don't snitch. I don't know what you want to call it, but we definitely know how to get justice in our where I'm from, in other ways besides traditional policing or reporting. I don't trust these institutions to give me the justice that I wanted. So the way I got my justice out of this clearly epistemologically violent occurrence where people were flattening my experience and my very agentic choice to leave an institution was to write an article unpacking. Wait a minute. This is not the reason why. That's the way I got my peace. That's the way I got my justice. I did not trust that the institution, and I have historical, mommy informed, and also just living as a Black woman in America, informed ways of understanding that you're not always going to get justice by reporting plagiarism or reporting misrepresentations. There's other ways that we can get our justice. So that's to contextualize. But let me tell you how mommy taught me how to do stuff like that, how to handle these types of betrayals. In that middle picture, my mom was 44 years old, 43 years old. My brother and sister, my brother's on the left, my sister's on the right. They were 14 and 15 years old. And my mom knew she had been here for 2 years in the United States, and she was getting so much pressure to abort me. Okay. Now, she was getting pressure to abort me because number one, she was 44 years old. And so at that time, it wasn't as common as it is now for women of a certain age. So they told her all the ways and all the things that potentially could go wrong with her pregnancy. And she felt maybe that was her interpretation, but she felt like she was getting told that she needed to have an abortion. And she just was like, you know what? I'm choosing to keep my child regardless, right? And that's a very interesting story, especially given my position now as a special education scholar without a disability. Disability was used as a threat in for this Black woman who was an immigrant who had only certain experiences, financial opportunities. By the way, my dad took that picture, so my dad's always been out of the picture and in the picture too. And that's again another presentation. Maybe that's a book. In the book, you'll figure out that part. But she she didn't romanticize, never, the fact that she was an oppressed person. And if you read multiple articles, there's this consciousness of the fact that we are people who were born into experiences in which society marginalizes you or oppresses you or sees you as other or lesser than. She was very much aware in that when she took that picture that there was a stigma, that she was being stigmatized and she was being pressured and she was being made to feel some kind of way that she was a Black woman of a certain age having a baby in the United States. Have y'all heard of the anchor babies and all that kind of stuff? I mean, there's so many things, and just also the rhetoric. I was born in 1982. The rhetoric about Black women's reproductive choices. I mean, and how everything was the Black mother's fault, right? Like it was like fever pitch in the 1980s, and so she was aware of that. So she threw a party. She threw a party for my brother and sister because she was afraid. She was aware that she was being judged by others, but she was afraid that her children were going to judge her. This consciousness of the stigma, this consciousness of how women are being judged, how women are being reduced, flattened, assumptions are being made about their intentions, about their importance. The reality of the oppression, right, of the forces in our lives that make us feel lesser, or question our choices or question our even desires to reproduce. She was aware of it and she wanted to disrupt it. So she threw a party. That I was in that picture. I'm in the picture in the middle. In her belly. She threw a party for my brother and sister to reframe what had been framed to her as a problem that needed a correction. And I grew up hearing how excited my brother and sister were about me coming to this world, even though I was a surprise, right? I was a surprise. Um, but we were so excited. We threw this party. And so as soon as I could remember being a little girl, I remember anti-blackness. It's one of the first things I started talking about. I remember anti-blackness. I remember being told I was black all the time. You're black, 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 in a way that was problematic. But in my house, it was beautiful. So this tension of understanding identities that we embody, that are seen as as marginalized, oppressed, lesser than, but also knowing more, knowing better that these public perceptions or these societal descriptions of who we are is not the full story, and that we are agentic, we can do something about it, is something that my mom taught me in her examples and in her stories, and how she dealt with the fact that she was very aware. I think it would be dangerous for us who embody these marginalized identities. It'll be dangerous for us to not be um to romanticize the realities that society sees us as less than, even if we don't buy into it. So me learning that I was poor in when I was 18, I thought I was middle class, but right before I went to Dartmouth, I realized, oh no, I'm not. That was the right time for me to learn that. That was right. It was useless for me to see myself as poor before then. But going to Dartmouth, it was very useful. And again, that's a mommy informed way of doing it, because I didn't hear the part of my mom's after she had me, without her authorization, the doctors tied her tubes without her permission, right? Stuff like that happened to Black women, Latina women, immigrants. They happen to women at these intersections, poor women, all the time. They, without her authorization, they did that. I didn't learn that until later. First, I started hearing the stories of how excited everyone was that I was born. Then I got the more details of like, so anyways, I don't know if that was a clean answer to your question, Kamaria, but for me, and hopefully in writing this book and fleshing out more what I mean by this mommy informed, right, way of being and way of knowing, because my way of knowing is connected to my way of being, and the ethical moves I make is connected to both. It, she's just modeled like thoughtfulness. She modeled for me, and she was just, she didn't forget that the world was not made necessarily for her for her best interest. However, she was going to make the best out of what the world could offer. Ah, and I know she's not the only one, but she's the one that I'm going to write about. All right, so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm at a storytelling mode. It's going to take about 10 minutes, and it's good. Hopefully, it's going to be really good. Hopefully, you'll like it. Um, I am going to share, because people asked me to share this slide. So I'm going to share this slide one more time, the one. And then as I share the slide of that table, um, I'm just going to read from my second feminist formation piece. And that's the one where I'm learning about my mom's roots. So I spent quite a bit of time talking about my roots and where I came from, and how mommy shaped the way I am and how I am as a researcher, and my relationship with Blackness and my relationship with methods, and so on and so on. Um, I'm going to share the stories of how how my grandmother, who I never met, how she's part of that as well. So here I'm going to, is this okay if I show you this and then I read something else? Everyone, we're doing okay? All right. So here's, oh, well, hold on, everyone. I'm going to share this, and then I'm going to not share it because I can't. I'm not as talented as I thought I was. I thought I could, hold on, maybe I can. Um, hmm. Nope, nope. Well, nope, I can't. So I hope those who wanted to see the slides, it's going to be recorded. I can share this with you in the future. just a little bit. This is a second feminist formation article. It came out 2023. It is about my grandmother and how, remember I said Black feminists call to know what you know. This particular paper, I call myself a feminist. So I explain a little bit my relationship to being a Black woman, but, and how I was always Black and how, like, apparently that's controversial, but it shouldn't be. Okay, I talked about that. But this notion of being a feminist, right? Of being a Black feminist, what does that mean? And so I found out that many of the feminists, early feminists in the Dominican Republic, were also teacher educators and pedagogues like me. And so here I am, I'm Dominican, I'm a Black feminist, and I'm looking into who these pedagogues were. And I'm like, these are not my people. Even though we can share these identities, um, I do a I do an interesting retracing and connections between what was going on in Dominican Republic and how a lot of these feminists were very anti-Black. And then I talk about in the Dominican Republic, even if they were of African descent, there was a lot of anti-Blackness that they were pushing forward in the curriculum, in the formal curriculum, a lot of anti-Haitianism, a lot of anti-Blackness in the formal curriculum that were being pushed forward by these women who call themselves feminists and teacher educators. And then I put that in conversations with what I know about my grandmother. And now I've been saying I'm going to read this for a while. I'm going to finally read this story about my grandmother that has been told to me through the oral tradition. Okay, we're doing okay with the fact that, let's see. Okay, we're doing okay. All right, let me stop the sharing. Thanks for all the responsiveness in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share and I am going to listen. No, you're going to listen. I'm going to read. Here we go. Ready? Story time. All right. So this is the story of my grandmother and how my grandmother went from a rose to a mama osa. Anybody knows what mama osa means? That phrase, mama osa, what that means in Spanish. Mama osa. If you can translate it to English, put it in the chat. Mother bear. That's right. Mama bear. Mama bear. Right? Like the three bears. Okay? Mama osa. So my grandmother's name was Rosa, Rose. And how did she transfigure from a rose to from a rose to a mama bear, right? To Mama Osa. Or is it a mama bear? And then I'm gonna show you this woman real quick, my grandmother. I never met her. Um Here she is. And I'm gonna show you this picture. This is a cool slide on the right. I think it's a cool slide. So um I don't know if you all know this, but we are forged, or at least the egg part of us, those of us who come, and you know what, things are changing, the world is changing, but um if you see the image of the pregnant woman, I never met my grandmother, but according to biology, the egg part of who I am, right, when I was made a long 1982, like I said, 44-year-old mother, she when I was forged, when we are forged, all of us, there's a time that a part of us is in our grandmother's womb. And I'm going to start off reading this quote about that. Okay. My grandmother's the woman on the left at Mama Osa. That's Mama Osa that I'm going to read the story about. And I'm going to read something regarding this image that you all are looking at. And then I'm going to read. I feel like I've been like doing this introduction for some time. This is such an awkward situation to do this on Zoom, but we're doing it. We're doing it, and we're doing it well. Hopefully. All right, stop share. Here we go. So there she is. That's Mama Osa. That's who I'm going to talk about. All right. And here's the logic behind the image of the pregnant woman. It is often said that the first sound we hear in the womb is our mother's heartbeat. Actually, the first sound to vibrate our newly developed hearing apparatus is the pulse of our mother's blood through her veins and arteries. We vibrate to that primordial rhythm even before we have ears to hear. Before we were conceived, we existed in part as an egg in our mother's ovary. All the eggs a woman will ever carry form in her ovaries while she is a 4-month-old fetus in the womb of her mother. This means our cellular life as an egg begins in the womb of our grandmother. Each of us spent 5 months in our grandmother's womb if we did if our mothers did the full 9-month terms, these each of us and all of us assumptions, you got to be careful with those, but most of us, I'm gonna say, I think this is not, I'm reading someone else's language. Each of us or most of us spent 5 months in our grandmother's womb, and she in turn formed within the womb of her grandmother. We vibrate to the rhythms of our mother's blood before she herself is born. And this pulse is the thread of blood that runs all the way back through the grandmothers to the first mother. We all share the blood of the first mother. We are truly children of one blood. Now, this is a poetic description. It's not mine. A poetic description of this notion of like a part of us forms within the womb of our grandmother, and that's the logic behind that image. I never got to meet her, but apparently a part of me once was a part of her in her being. So, okay, let's read this narrative. The story of how my grandmother Rosa came to establish herself in the mountains of Sanchez Samana, Dominican Republic, sheds light on the local historical and structural issues faced by those who were multiply marginalized in her era. Rosa saw freedom through a personal marriage to the mountains. There, she resisted the intersections of anti Blackness, capitalism, imperialism, and patriarchal restrictions. In those mountains, she transfigured into Mama Osa. Beyond a change in name or title, she asserted her dignity and conjured prestige. My grandmother was analfabeta. Analfabeta literally means girl or woman without letters, which is a far more accurate term to describe her than its common English translation, which is illiterate. See, my grandmother wasn't illiterate, she just didn't have letters. My grandmother enacted and imparted multiple literacies: oral, communal, spiritual, to make sense and create meaning of her world. Despite her inability to read or write, therefore, memories of her lived experiences have effectively been passed down throughout the oral tradition and throughout several generations. To understand the Dominican Republic that shaped my grandmother's time, I first consulted mommy. I then turned to Spanish and English written texts. I not only leaned on US based scholars, but also authors situated in the Dominican Republic. These transgenerational, translanguage, and transnational affirmations help to flesh out my understanding of mommy's stories. In fulfilling my part in sustaining the oral tradition, I have read aloud and retold this written narrative with groups of women, and today we have all genders, right? With groups of women who self-identified as daughters of Africa. For example, women from Ghana, Haiti, Jamaica, and Sierra Leone. I always found it odd that my grandmother was called Osa, which means bear, especially since there are no bears in the Dominican Republic. But I found one listener's reaction to her transfiguration story quite revealing. After one retelling, like the one I will do now, I learned that the meaning of the word Osa in Ido which is a Benin language spoken in Nigeria, and the meaning of that is God, the divine. So she went from a rose, Rosa, to Doña, to Mama Osa. Exasperated by the anti Black and denigrating rhetoric of her marido's fairer skinned and straighter haired family, Rosa decided to leave Atomayor, Dominican Republic in 1936. She could no longer tolerate his family's incessant questioning of his choice to partner with her. They suggested their union set the family back because she was too Black. Just before getting on the boat that would take her to the Sierras of Samana, she visited a trusted friend and dropped hints about her plans. After peeling and eating an orange, she hung up the spiraled rind and said to her comadre, just like her godmother, or like god sister more, even though it's comadre, it's like co godmothers, right? You see this rind? By the time it darkens, I'll be long gone. And so when Rosa's comadre finally made tea with the dried up orange peel, Rosa was already dozens of miles away and hundreds of feet high, constructing a new home in the mountains. She did not see her comadre again until almost 3 decades later. As signaled by her birth name, Rosa, Rose, she was more complex than first meets the eye. Her attractive and feminine physique belied her defensive thorns. Rosa styled herself, sewing her own dresses, blouses, and skirts. She often kept her coiled hair in a bun. Her conspicuous African heritage incensed her in laws, though they too were of African, Taino, and Iberian heritage. Her pride pushed them away. Rosa did not suffer fools, nor did she tolerate disrespect. She was also a calculating woman. When she decided to leave Atomayor, she left behind her common law husband, Regla, as she called him, and their 3 children. She had already lost a 4-year-old son and a toddler daughter to illness. Where she planned on going was too harsh a place to raise small children on her own. So as soon as my grandfather knew Rosa was gone, he decided to join her and sought out the fishermen who had helped her escape. In following her to the mountains, he left behind his hometown and all claims to any land he owned. He was tall and lanky. My grandfather and his brothers were gavilleros. They're called bandits. Gavilleros are bandits. A collective of men and women who between 1916 and 1924 fought fiercely against the U.S. occupation of the island. Perhaps his adolescent years spent tracking and evading U.S. soldiers to the mountains taught him the skills needed to find a rose in the mountains. When he finally reunited with Rosa near Sanchez, they resumed their life together and he established himself as a butcher. His neighbors in Sanchez referred to him as Manuel Regla, el terror del este. So Manuel Regla, the terror of the East. He was like this, like, man, never met him either. I told you he died when my mom was 11, but I know all his prayers. That's the beauty of the oral tradition. Anyways, demonstrating the respect of fear Dominicans throughout the country maintained for the criminalized peasants and rural bandits who rebelled against their imperial neighbor. In the mountainous region of Sanchez Rosa kept a healthy distance not only from the anti-Black slurs she heard in the East, but also from the incessant political intrigue and cult of personality rising in Ciudad Trujillo, the country's capital, Santo Domingo, that U.S.-backed dictator Rafael Trujillo renamed after himself. In absconding, she rejected the normative expectations to stay meek and subjugated to either Regla's family or to the white supremacist norms that was reaching a fever pitch throughout the Dominican Republic. Mami was born approximately 2 years after Rosa and Regla both settled in the mountains. She came to know her mother as Rosa, Regla's rendering of Rosa's name since it was hard for him to pronounce the Spanish R. One of Mami's earliest memories is of walking side by side with Rosa, literally on foot since they did not own shoes, each with wears on their heads. Despite her father's warrior past and intimidating nickname, Mami remembered him as a kind man who helped Rosa with domestic duties. Her drastic decision to depart to the mountains resulted in a reconfigured dynamic with Regla and their children, one separate from the cruel anti-Black sentiments she once endured. In the mountains of Samana, far from the life she once knew, Rosa asserted herself in ways she could not before. She joined collectives of women who engaged in intuitive, spiritual, and feminine knowledges. They taught each other how to make use of the land and sustain themselves through mutual support. Instead of attacks on her appearance and ancestry, she drew the admiration of her neighbors by showcasing her willingness to work, assess what services were needed in her new community, and for her ingenuity. The respect Hosa creatively conjured in the rural terrains of Samana manifested itself in how her neighbors addressed her. Though she was a common law wife of a rural peasant, everyone in the mountains referred to her as Doña, a title designated for prominent and formerly married women in Dominican society. Doña Rosa had 4 more children after Mami and became a widow. When her husband fell ill, her comadres traded coconut oil, rice, beans, and grains for the goods she sold. They also helped her find the herbs needed to soothe his discomfort. After Regla passed away at the age of 45, Doña Rosa remained single for the rest of her life. To support herself, she continued to raise and eat the goats, chickens, and pigs Regla once kept and sold. She was fiercely protective of her daughters, willing to wield a machete. You guys know what a machete? I grew up with machetes in my house. I don't know if y'all grew up with machetes. I was scared of the machetes. Okay, she grew up. Well, my grandmother supposedly she would beat a man up with a machete with the smooth. Anyways, she was a tough little lady. Anyways, we're not glorifying violence. She protected her daughters, willing to wield a machete against any man who assumed them vulnerable after Regla's death. For decades, she stayed in community with her neighbors in Sanchez, especially with the young girls and women of the mountains. She became a regional midwife, highly regarded and often sought out when women were having gynecological challenges. She also delivered some of her own grandchildren. By the time Mommy developed into a young woman, Doña Rosa had transfigured into Mama Osa. Her reputation as a no nonsense widow, honorable and capable of humbling even the burliest of men, persists to this day. Now, how did Mama Osa know to go to the mountains? How did she conjure the courage and imagination needed to reaffirm her dignity and heal from the trauma motivating her escape to the mountains? It wasn't from a feminist formation article, y'all. Okay. It wasn't from a higher ed book. Okay. Which I write. Listen, it's my job. But given the historical and political trajectory that forges Black fugitivity and refusals, by the 20th century, the cimarrones, which is the Spanish word for maroons, right? Maroons, of the 16th and 17th century were well ingrained in the Dominican consciousness and lexicon. In drawing connections between Mama Osa's escape to the mountains and the multiple ways African descendants or ascendants enact marriage, um, these things are memorialized in Dominican and other trans-American imaginaries. So if you have like family members or you're rooted in the United States or in the Americas, wherever, there's like a maroon story in a song, in a, most of us have the boonings, some kind of like marriage, physical marriage that is embedded in many of our oral traditions and ways of being. So I situate her specific move within a history of Black women's marriage, especially here in the Americas, and fugitivity. So the individual and group marriage of African ascendientes has been memorialized in many spaces in Dominican folklore, poetry, songs, and historical novels, although some official Dominican retellings have been sympathetic to Spanish colonizers. Not some, a lot of the official retellings are sympathetic to our Spanish colonizers. Regardless of whether these narratives frame Maroons as participants of failed rebellions or as heroic anti imperialists, they consistently contradicted stereotypes of Black and Indigenous people as ignorant, submissive, and content to be in proximity to whiteness. What was it? What was it that you said, Wilson? The insistence, the insistence of Blackness.
Insistence. Yeah, insistence.
Yeah, there was the insistence of Blackness. Not all of us wanted to be close to the whiteness. Not all of us needed that. In fact, many of us found the toxicity there. Us, and that us is in connection to my grandmother. Okay. So the legacy of African Maroons and the path to freedom from oppressive ideologies and practices they found in the mountains are undeniable. So when Wilson, Dr. Okello, approached me about the theme of this series, and he even checked in because he's a compassionate colleague to make sure that I still wanted to do this even after, the tragic passing of my mom. I wasn't expecting it, y'all. I knew I had to tell this story, and I've been exploring and processing, like, what are my ethical moves? What are my considerations? And IRB is not enough for me. I have a lot of other people I'm answerable to, whether they're physically here or not, like my grandmother, in how I do research and how I tell stories, even tell stories of my own. Because that example that Kamaria, Dr. Porter, talked about that flattening of experiences that happen in a particular article, we are encouraged, many of us who are racialized people, Black folks, we are encouraged to be the exceptional one. We are encouraged to tell our dramatic sob stories, right? There are some stories that you guys will never, ever get to hear about my family because I know that the majority of the people who are reading, physically reading what I'm writing, wouldn't necessarily have the sensitivity to understand all those details, right? So even in what I shared with you, there's a lot of things that I didn't share because I'm not sure who's reading it, but I shared what I thought was appropriate, right? And it's not a flattening, right? I tried the best that I can to trans language and transgenerationally and transnationally conveying very complex things. I did the best I can. But yes, that was an enactment in that storytelling, an enactment of these mommy informed ways of thinking about research and ethics and who I am in this knowledge making, knowledge legitimizing enterprise that I'm involved in as an academic. And that's it. I'm gonna stop there. Yay. I did it. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Um, Thank you. I'm going to react to what you just said, but not take too much time so we can engage with some of the great questions in the chat, and maybe my reaction will dovetail with that. I'm thinking about mommy, your mother, and I'm going to call her Doña Osa with great respect for your grandmother, and their moves. Doña Osa to the mountains, and one of your mother's experiences of going back to uh, Donna Clara's house. So, so in thinking of, so let's back up a little bit to our research as Black feminists. We engage in what's categorized as qualitative research. I would say what you just shared with us is much more than that. And thinking about just the other day, seeing a tweet from somebody getting a reviewer comment on a qualitative research article that it's not generalizable. And my response, particularly listening to your narrative just now, is it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be instructive. It's supposed to be instructive of systems of power and what they produce. In Danya Osa's story, we see the fugitivity. Black people just know we have to get out. We know our freedom is elsewhere, and we know it's of a great risk, particularly Black women. Also in Danya Osa's story, we see that she became the answer to reproductive rights in a midwife, and overcoming the violence that Black pregnant bodies encounter in modern medical systems. We see in Danya Osa's story the machete to protect her daughters from gender-based violence, of which Black women are subjected to in every context. We also see that Danya Osa cared for the family, not as a weak, stereotypical single mother, but as a strong pillar of the society. So it's not supposed to be generalizable. That was a particular story forged by a particular special woman that you had contact with in those 5 months in the gestational period. So when we think about, so let's bring it back up to today, um, and to contrast these two stories in your feminist formations articles. Mommy, your mother, going back to Donna Clara's house, you mirrored it to you going to Harvard University, back to an Ivy League institution, and maybe even that carries on to where we are today at Penn State, at a predominantly white institution. Um, but your mother knew that that was a move for her greater survival, for her greater for you eventually. But also we have Doña Osa, who escaped to the mountains. Um,
Two very different women. Two
two
very,
very different women, two
my
very
mom
different
and
times.
my grandma were not similar in character.
No,
No, my
no,
mom
no,
didn't have a machete. She wasn't a machete wielder. My
no, no,
grandma.
no. That was two different. Yes, yes, two different women. So how do we reconcile those two those moves? Two different women, two different times. And one of the questions in the chat is, how do we know what we know in the white academy, um, and knowing what is required when our research is not generalizable, but our research, you just covered all of the social science issues in that story. So who do we follow?
Oh man, that was such a great question, and I'm giggling. Um, like I said, thank you all for like your patience with this presentation. Like it's very personal, very awkward and strange to do at this point because I'm still mourning mommy, and also, um, like I said, I do talks and you kind of get comfortable with the talk. This was a brand new one. So I know the next time I do this again, and I imagine I will, it'll be a lot sharper. So thank you so much for like just indulging me. And your question, like there is a huge difference between my mother and my grandmother. Like huge in terms of their personalities, in terms of my grandmother would cut someone off and not see them again ever again, and she would be just fine. And my mom, her daughter, would be the one be like, "Oh, come on, mom." Like, she was the peacemaker. She actually was the one who, if it wasn't for my mom, my grandmother would have never returned to that land that I told you that she ran away from. Um, my mom was the one who facilitated her return after 20 something years back over there. She had no intentions. Her husband, even when he got sick, he would go by himself to see his family. She was like, I'm not going there. And I think one thing I appreciate about Black feminism, it's first of all, it's very much about coalition building, and it honors all women, right? At least the Black feminist tradition that I follow, and the complexity and the differences. It goes back to this notion of policing, which I see so much happen in higher ed spaces. People are constantly performing and feeling like they got to perform the right kind of justice oriented disposition, language, ways of being, because some folks try to say this is the one way of doing equity or justice. This is the right way. This is the way. And what mommy taught me, and it's not just with her mother, it's with a lot of different people in her life, is that she really respected, even if she didn't agree with the way, and she honored the decision making processes of all the women in her life. My mom did. I have aunts who made decisions that I know my mom wouldn't have made with their children, and like whenever, or even my grandmother, there are some things my grandmother did that I ask her questions about, like, hey mommy, like with my 21st century lens and the fact that I had a formal education and I lived in this space and I had all of these ways of being that and opportunities and like a washing machine, right? Like stuff like that, and I would forget that that's not what my grandmother was experiencing. So I would ask a question about why would she do that? And why did your mom allow this to happen? And my mom, even if she didn't agree with her mom's choices, always attempted to contextualize what her mom was doing. And that contextualization, and again, it's not romanticizing, it's not ignoring the fact that she wouldn't have moved that way, it's not pretending that everything's great, right, and everything was fine, but it's just empathizing and understanding that not everybody moves the way she does. And that sense of grace, that sense of respect and admiration. I'm telling you, my mom mourned her mom a long time. Like I remember her mourning her mom when she was gone. Um, that sense of respect for her mom is probably why I respect my mom as much as I do. Do you think the society teaches me to to look at people like my mom? Not even the society. We're all academics, or most of us are academics here. Do we position women like my mother or my grandmother in the academy as brilliant knowledge makers? Like I'm doing, and I'm saying it not because, I mean, I mean it with my whole heart. And I showed you how many times I've been saying that women like my mom and my grandmother are informing my scholarship. Like I am, like, does the academy position these women as folks that we should learn from? Has it? No. Hopefully in 5 years down the line, 10 years, maybe, maybe less. Hopefully, when I ask this question again later on, people will say some of us do, right? Or it's getting better. But I learned to do it. I asked earlier the question, I asked myself, I don't know what possessed me. I said, to do this, to write all of these articles, when people who were reviewing my tenure file probably were like, what is she doing? What does this have to do with interventions? Um, but the answer is my mom's example. My mom honored her mom and uplifted her ways of being and told me stories about her, and just just made it super clear that she wouldn't be who she was if it wasn't for her. And maybe because of that, or not maybe, it's because of that, I am compelled to do the same to my mom, right? And hopefully my daughter and I have authored things together. By the way, my daughter is 19 years old, and she's a student at Brown University, and we have a co-authored paper together. And she's pretty cool. Hopefully she'll honor me in the same way. I don't know. She might get sick of me, right? I don't know. But I see her that at least we have one paper together, right? She definitely saw what the pattern is in our family. We uplift the matriarch. Um, yeah, it's hard, but something you said, uh, Marlon Wayans is a comedian. Y'all might know him, and I'm not necessarily the biggest Marlon Wayans fan. I was a huge fan of his brothers and A Living Color when I was a little girl, and he did a Breakfast Club interview. I steal a lot of, not steal because I always cite where it comes from, but I get a lot of quotes from these like rapper interviews and like hip hop interviews. And so in this Breakfast Club interview, he talked about how he did this whole comedy special about how Smith, the Will and Jada Smith smack, the Will smack, right? But it was connected, not funny. The Will smack. Again, we're not promoting violence. The smack that Will Smith did, and the Jada Pinkett entitlement story, right? He does a whole comedy routine about how that's evidence for him that God loves him. He did a whole comedy routine on that. And super controversial, just like most comedians. But in the interview he did afterwards, his mom had passed away, and he talked about how he had grieved 50 something people in a span of 2 or 3 years. And he said, you know what? Clearly, Will Smith smacking someone is not all about me, but I can't help, he said. I can't help but filter this world through my life and my experiences and how things impact me. I think this performance that a lot of researchers engage in, and it's not just qualitative researchers, it's all researchers, to try to generalize all the things for everybody as if we can engage in sense making in the bodies and understandings of everyone is a performance that has kind of, it's the time's up. You know, his comment about I can't help but just like I can't help but process this situation as being evidence of my life, you know, and God loving me. That's what he was talking about. That's how a lot of us are processing everything, even what our participants are telling us, even when we're engaging in studies and we're trying to represent, and we do member checking, and we're trying to represent to the best of our capacity what they intended to say. We're still filtering through our experiences, you know, as a person in the academy who's documenting a research process and what they found in a conversation. um I am an editor, and I'm very fortunate to be an editor. And I am an editor of a journal that you were a former associate editor of, Alicia Dowd. It's a high impact journal. And we are asking for positionality statements, not just from qualitative researchers. The days where those who are engaging in more traditional methods don't position their entry point into a conversation and a data analysis, I think those days are wrapping up, because not all of us assume that just because someone has a PhD, they are neutrally engaging data. Like that assumption is no longer held by everyone who is doing and engaging in peer review. And so making it explicit, I even said it in one podcast, another podcast, um, I said, if you are a positivist and you think that you are neutral, you still have to say that. Don't take it as, don't make the assumptions anymore that everyone who's reading you and who's peer reviewing you is sharing that assumption. Those days are are going by the wayside.
Yes, most definitely. I mean, as social scientists, even if it is quantitative research, I mean, these large population studies, where do you think they come from? Somebody came to your door, asked you some questions, and there's a social process between even how the person reads the question that you wrote. You better ask somebody, because that's exactly what's going on. It's always a social process. And there are underlying assumptions that are occurring in those instances, and we need to be thoughtful and intentional, and then disclose that intentionality. um so we have some more time. Would any people like to read a question they put in the chat, or surface a question that's on the tippy top of your minds right now, to bring our community to think about before we close?
Uh, well, perhaps we could just all engage in by thanking Dr. Boveda, thanking you, Dr. Porter, for this rich, thoughtful, beautiful offering. So just yes. So in any way that you all would like to demonstrate that appreciation, thank you earnestly.
Thank you.
And what can, where can we find you, and what's coming up for you? What in terms of work that we should be on the lookout for both Dr. Boveda and Dr. Porter?
For Dr. Boveda, because Dr. Porter's face told me she's got to think of it. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter X Twitter. I'm on Penn State. Google me.
And
I'm
forthcoming.
accessible.
Yep.
At upcoming projects, you know, there's an article that came out this year that I want you guys to check out in Educational Researcher with my colleague Dr. Anima, where we talk about the ontopistemic, um, the socio-historical, the sociocultural, in terms of positionality. A lot of people say to position yourself in your work, and positioning matters, but I think that's a new article that talks about in a way that I think is accessible, hopefully, to many researchers, how to engage in positioning. And like, not everybody has time to go over their whole ancestry like I did, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe it will be too painful for me. Like, these tracings have been joyful and affirming. Some
Mm.
the tracings may not be as joyful and affirming as it was for me, and I recognize that.
Mhm.
The book, we'll see. I gotta write it first. I'm working on it, Francisca. Thank you for the pressure. Maria.
Yes, you can Google me as well. And I have a upcoming chapter in a edited volume, Cops on Campus, Rethinking Safety and Confronting Police Violence, where I talk about Black women's experiences and their legal cynicism against campus policing and how campus policing's actions confirm that legal cynicism and confirm that violence in the violence that they do.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we are just over time. And so again, thank you to you both. For those who are still here, we will the recording will be available in the next week or so. So again, be on the lookout for a follow-up email. Thank you again to everyone who has contributed to bringing this together. We appreciate you. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar in February, where we will be discussing Black aesthetics. And so thank you again. Wishing you all well and an ease to the end of the semester.